I woke up to a sharp ringing in my ears, my vision foggy as the world slowly came into focus. I was sitting on cold pavement, my hands braced against the rough ground. The noise around me was muted, but the hum of distant traffic was still there. My heart was racing, pounding against my chest like it was trying to break free. When I looked down, I saw my phone lying next to me, its screen shattered. Cracks ran across the glass like spiderwebs. How did I end up here? I couldn't recall. My mind was a haze, replaying bits and pieces of last night, before dinner at Lucia's house. She was my boss, always composed, always in control. But that evening, something about it felt off. It wasn't like any other time I'd been around her. And now, here I was sitting on the edge of a city street with no memory of how I'd gotten here. I tried to calm my breathing when a shadow fell over me. Looking up, I saw her, Lucia. She stood there, her coat wrapped tightly around her, eyes locked on me with a look I couldn't quite read. There was no surprise on her face, no concern, just a quiet intensity that sent a chill down my spine. What happened? I asked hoarsely, my throat dry, but she didn't answer. Instead, she knelt beside me, gently placing her hand on my arm. "Come with me, David," she said in a voice that was calm, almost soothing. I hesitated. Something about the whole situation felt wrong. Her gaze, the overwhelming sense of disorientation, but then she helped me to my feet. Her grip was firm, and together we walked away from the street, disappearing into the night, leaving behind the broken phone, the cold concrete, and the questions that still hung in the air. The drive back was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that only makes you more aware of the questions you can't answer. Lucia's focus was entirely on the road, her hands steady on the wheel, while I couldn't stop replaying the last few hours in my head. The gaps were too big to fill. The image of me sitting on that pavement, confused and out of place, lingered in my mind. When we arrived, she parked in front of my apartment. I looked over at her, unsure of what to say. Before I could even open the door, she spoke. "David," she said, her voice softer than usual. "What happened earlier?" I frowned, turning to face her. "It's nothing to worry about," she replied before I could ask more. I met her gaze, still confused. "Nothing to worry about?" "Lucia," I woke up on the street. For the first time since we left, her eyes met mine. Her expression was unreadable. Things get blurry sometimes. "Just trust me, okay?" There was that subtle tension, that unspoken something between us. I wanted to press her for answers, but instead, I just nodded. Maybe it was her calmness or the exhaustion that had taken over, but I let it go for now. As I reached for the door handle, her hand brushed mine. I froze under the dim light of the street lamp, and she leaned in closer, her breath warm against my cheek. Then, without warning, she kissed me. It wasn't planned, and it definitely wasn't expected. It was quick, almost like it didn't happen, but it left me standing there, motionless. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and self-doubt. I tried to convince myself it didn't matter, that it was just a moment of weakness on both our parts. But the memory of that kiss lingered. Every time I saw Lucia at work, it was like the air between us had changed. Her presence felt heavier, her gaze sharper, and yet she acted like nothing had happened. A few days later, she invited me to her house again to discuss the project. She said it casually, like everything was still strictly professional. I knew I should decline, but something inside me urged me to agree. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe something darker. I need to understand what was really going on between us. Her house was as I remembered, quiet, tastefully decorated, with an underlying sense of control that seemed to mirror her. We sat in her living room, papers spread out between us, the project the focus of the moment. At first, it was all business. Her tone was measured, her concentration sharp. But as the night wore on, the conversation shifted. She started talking about her life, the hard work it had taken to get where she was, the sacrifices she had made. "You remind me of myself," she said suddenly, her voice softer, more personal. The ambition, the drive, but also the uncertainty. She moved closer to where I was sitting, and I could feel the tension thick in the air. "I see so much potential in you," she continued, her hand resting on the arm of the chair next to me. "But there's still so much you need to learn." Her fingers brushed against mine, and I felt that same strange pull from the car. Before I could process it, she leaned in again. This kiss was different, stronger, more deliberate. It wasn't quick or hesitant like the first one. It was charged with an intensity that made it impossible to pull away. My mind screamed that this was wrong, but my body betrayed me. And for a moment, I kissed her back. Time seemed to stretch. The room around us faded. And the only reality was the closeness between us, the undeniable pull. But then, just as suddenly, she pulled away, her eyes locking with mine in that same unreadable way. "You're doing well, David," she whispered, her hand still on mine. "But remember, some lines, once crossed, can't be undone." I sat there, heart racing, unsure of what had just happened, and even more unsure of what it meant. After that night at Lucia's, nothing felt the same. Each passing day seemed to blur into the next. But every time I saw her, the weight of what had happened pressed down on me. I tried to convince myself it was just a lapse, a mistake that wouldn't happen again. But Lucia had a way of making me feel like everything was still in my control, while pulling me deeper into something I didn't fully understand. That evening, her message arrived, brief, direct, and to the point. "Meet me at the lake." A knot formed in my stomach as I read it. The lake was a quiet escape, a secluded spot just beyond the city. People went there to get away from the noise, to breathe for a moment in peace. It wasn't the kind of place you'd meet your boss. At least not unless there was something else going on. And deep down, I knew there was. I drove there in silence, my hands white-knuckling the steering wheel, my thoughts running in circles. With every mile, my pulse quickened, and when I finally pulled up, the air felt unnervingly still. The water lay like glass, undisturbed. Lucia stood at the edge, her figure outlined against the fading light. She turned when she heard me approach, her face calm, but her eyes, those eyes, still carried the same weight, the same intensity one had come to dread. "Thanks for coming," she said, her voice soft, as if we were just two colleagues meeting for a casual chat. But there was no mistaking the tension between us. The air felt thick, charged. My heart hammered in my chest. I stood a few feet away, unsure of what to say, unsure of what I had even come for. But Lucia moved first. "David," she began, her tone low, measured. "I know things have been complicated." Her gaze lingered, reading me, assessing my every move. "But there's something we need to address." I said nothing. My mind was a blur, running through every possible reason we were here. But nothing could have prepared me for what she said next. "You've crossed a line," she stated, her voice shifting to something sharper, more serious. "And so have I." My throat tightened. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. I didn't know what to say. "Lucia, I never meant for." She cut me off with a dismissive gesture. "I know this isn't about blaming anyone," she said, her hand now resting lightly on my arm. The contact sent an electric shock through me, just like in her house, in her car. That same pull. I should have stepped back. I should have resisted. But I didn't. I stayed frozen, waiting, caught in something I couldn't explain. She leaned in then, her lips brushing against mine. It was slow this time, methodical, like she was waiting to see how far I'd let it go. I didn't stop her. I let it happen. When she pulled away, her eyes were different, softer, maybe, or just less guarded. "I've been thinking about us," she said quietly, "about what this means for both of us." I shook my head, struggling to find the words. "Lucia, we can't keep doing this." She gave me a sad smile, almost rueful. "I know, but sometimes, when you've gone this far, stopping isn't really an option." I looked out at the lake, at the stillness of it all, and tried to make sense of what she had just said. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice almost a whisper. She sighed, her gaze shifting away as if trying to gather her thoughts. "I don't know," she admitted finally, "but we can't pretend things are the way they were." That hit me like a brick to the chest. The space between us had never been more charged. It felt like there was no way out of this tangled mess we had created. And deep down, I knew she was right. There was no going back. The days after that encounter felt like walking through a fog. I went through the motions at work, but my mind was elsewhere, constantly replaying everything that had happened. Lucia and I exchanged no casual glances anymore. Every look was heavy, layered with unspoken things. Dangerous things. Then, one morning, I showed up to the office early, hoping that immersing myself in work would somehow ease the knot in my stomach. But the moment I stepped through the door, I could feel something was off. There was a coldness in the air. People weren't looking at me. They were looking at me, if you know what I mean. There was a hushed tension, an almost palpable silence that followed me around. As I walked past Lucia's office, I noticed the door was closed. That alone made my stomach flip. It was rare for her to shut herself off like that. Unease settled in my gut, like I knew something was coming, something I wasn't ready for. By noon, I was called into the conference room. My heart nearly stopped when I stepped inside. Lucia was sitting at the head of the table, her expression unreadable. Surrounding her were several members of the executive team, their faces all stern and serious. There was an air of quiet judgment, heavy and oppressive. "Lucia?" I began, my voice unsure. "What's going on?" She didn't respond. Instead, one of the executives cleared his throat and spoke. "David, we've been reviewing concerns about your recent behavior and your interactions with Lucia. Given the situation, we think it's time to address these matters directly." The words didn't make sense at first. Concerns? Interactions? My mind was a haze. Then it hit me. This wasn't about a project. They knew, or at least they suspected, something I couldn't deny. "Wait," I stammered, trying to steady my nerves. "This is a misunderstanding." Before I could continue, Lucia finally spoke. Her voice was flat, distant. "David," she said, cutting me off, "I think it's better if we don't drag this out. We both know where this is headed." I stood there, frozen. My brain struggled to keep up. She wasn't defending me. She wasn't even acknowledging what had happened between us. It was like she had already made up her mind, like she was already thinking beyond all of this. "David," one of the executives interrupted again, his voice hard. "We're offering you the option to resign quietly. You can leave with dignity. This is your chance to avoid any further complications." Resign? The word hit me like a punch to the stomach. My career, everything I had worked for, slipping away in an instant, and I didn't know how to stop it. I turned to Lucia, hoping for some sign, any kind of reassurance. But she didn't look at me. She kept her gaze fixed on the table. Her silence screamed louder than anything she could have said. I tried to explain myself, to piece together the chaos that led me here, but nothing came out right. The words felt wrong, clumsy, and every attempt to fix it only made it worse. The room felt smaller. The air thickened, pressing down on me. I could barely breathe. And then, I stopped talking. The silence stretched on, suffocating. In that moment, I realized I had lost. Lucia wasn't going to stand by me, and there was no coming back from this. "Fine," I muttered, the weight of the decision sinking in, suffocating me. "I'll resign." As I got up to leave, Lucia finally looked at me. For a brief second, I saw something flicker in her eyes, maybe regret, maybe something more, but it was gone in the blink of an eye. She gave a slight nod, acknowledging that this was the only way forward. I walked out of the room, feeling numb, my legs heavy beneath me. The weight of the situation pressed down on my chest, and I had no idea how I was going to face the world outside. My resignation would be announced quietly. No drama. No scandal. Lucia would keep her position, her reputation intact, while mine crumbled into dust. Outside, the city hummed with life, completely indifferent to the storm that had just ripped through my world. As I stood on the sidewalk, staring at the passing cars, one thought haunted me. Had I been nothing but a pawn in her game all along? Was this all part of some bigger plan that I never stood a chance of winning? I didn't have the answers. All I knew was that my life had taken a turn I never could have predicted. And as I walked away from the office for the last time, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, I had never really known Lucia at all.